So this is Oneida, New York. Now Tri-Valley Lodge meets here. Hello, Worshipful Walter and the rest of the brothers there. Now this used to be all Oneida Nation land back in 1777. So Thomas Spencer, a scout from the Oneida Nation, made his way to Herkimer to warn him of what was going on at Fort Stanwix. And that prompted General Herkimer to call up the Tryon County militia and march their way to relieve Fort Stanwix. So this is the former home of Nicholas Herkimer. Today it is a state park that you can visit and take a tour of. Back in the 18th century when Nicholas Herkimer lived here, he actually assembled the Tryon County militia here on their march to Fort Stanwix in the Mohawk Valley campaign. Joseph Brant actually also lived in the area for a while, and it's most likely that they knew each other fairly well because these were small communities. So on November 13th, 1896, Huguenot Lodge celebrated their 100th anniversary with a big banquet. At that banquet was Grand Secretary Ehlers. He gave a nice speech, and during the speech he mentioned that the day prior he was up in Little Falls, New York, standing in for the Grand Master to consecrate this very monument to General Nicholas Herkimer at the Herkimer home. Now, if you remember from episode 2, we were in the Livingston Library, and Alex pulled out a lodge history book from 1907, and in that book was a stamp stating that it was in Ehlers' library, and now we know why he kept it in his library, because he is mentioned in that book along with his speech.
Herkimer was the Brigadier General Commander of the Tryon County Militia Brigade, and so you had all 4 regiments of the Tryon County Militia. The idea had been that they would march up to either come to the aid of the fort, or best case scenario, they and the garrison could trap the British between them, with Herkimer coming up from the east and the garrison coming out of the fort, and perhaps be able to trap the British forces in between them. But at the very least, the thought was they could continue to bring more, get more supplies and more reinforcements into the fort.
Of the Native Americans, I understand that Joseph Brant was in that contingent.
Yes, he was leading his own, what at least has become, in more modern history, become known as Brant's Volunteers, which was a mixed Loyalist and Indian group. He was leading his own, or that own unit, because the whites tended to think he had more authority within the Six Nations at that time than what he really did. Of course, as history has gone on, Brant, almost in all the early histories, is the one that is known as the leader of the Indians that were with the British here, and that is actually incorrect. It was 2 Seneca war chiefs were picked to be the war captains once the Indians decided they would support the British with the ambush at Oriskany.
So what exactly happened at the Battle of Oriskany?
Well, this is where you really see the results of the Civil War nature of most of the war in the Mohawk Valley coming out, because the common law wife of Sir William Johnson, or widow I should say by that point, Molly Brant, a Mohawk clan mother, was still living in the valley. She noted that the militia was beginning to assemble, and so she was able to send word up to her brother here in the siege lines that their old neighbor, Nicholas Herkimer, was coming up with the militia to come to the aid of the fort, and that's what gave British General St. Leger the ability to then detach the majority of his Loyalists and Indian forces to find a place to ambush Herkimer's men before they could get up here.
So we're walking along a hiking trail in the Hudson Valley. So this hiking trail would have been very similar to the military road that General Herkimer and the Tryon County Militia had marched through from Little Falls, New York to almost Fort Stanwix. It was about a 31-mile trip. It's August now, just like it was back then in 1777. And the mosquitoes out here are just absolutely insane. I can only imagine what it was like back then. They didn't have any insect repellent. So Herkimer's troops walked into a ravine. And they were basically kind of in a gully, if you will. They were surrounded by high ground. It was the perfect ambush site. The British troops and the Native Americans were pretty well concealed. They suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They surrounded them. Troops came in behind them, and the battle started. General Herkimer was shot early on in the fight. His troops placed him next to a tree. His horse was killed. They took the saddle off. They put it underneath General Herkimer. General Herkimer sat there giving directions, smoking a pipe for the majority of the battle. There are reports that Peter Bellinger, his second in command, had taken over at some point during the battle. That's not confirmed. No one really knows all the details of the battle. Peter Bellinger was Nicholas Herkimer's brother-in-law. He was married to General Herkimer's sister. General Herkimer had gotten forewarning about the ambush. He knew it was there. Unfortunately for General Herkimer, several of his troops felt that Herkimer may have some loyalist leanings, as his brother and his nephew were both on the loyalist side. Now, we also know that General Herkimer was in St. Patrick's Lodge with Sir John Johnson, so we don't know whether that was a factor in their perception as well. But it really was a mistake, because these gentlemen pushed General Herkimer to advance forward into that ambush, and they paid a very dear price for this. So militarily, Sir John Johnson had a huge advantage. It was a very well planned ambush. So the Native American troops, what they would do is they would run into the woods and conceal themselves. They'd wait for one of the shooters to reload. When that happened, they would come back out and they would strike with a hand-to-hand weapon, whether it's a tomahawk, a spear, a knife, whatever they had. They were very lightly armed, but they were very effective. Casualties were pretty massive, among the worst in the American Revolution. On the continental American side, there were about 385 killed outright. Could have been closer to 400, everything is estimated. There were about 50 people wounded, and there were about 30 soldiers who were captured. Now, these captured prisoners may as well just be counted as casualties as well, because pretty much were, after they were captured, they were forced to run a gauntlet with Native Americans, and this was part of their culture. They wanted to test the mettle of their opponent in war. They wanted to test how much of a man they were. They did all sorts of torture. I think in this case, it was basically you had to run a gauntlet, and the Native Americans would hit you with war hammers as you ran. Eventually, you died from it. It was a pretty brutal way to die. On the British side, there was about 7 non-Native Americans killed, about 21 captured, and there were about 65 Native Americans killed that day. So the Iroquois Confederacy, now more properly known as the Haudenosaunee peoples, Haudenosaunee translates roughly to the people of Longhouse, and that was both metaphorical and actually physical. For many years, hundreds of generations, they lived in longhouses. Now, this changed as the Europeans came in and influenced the housing design, and they started to live in more European-style homes. But it was also true metaphorically, because it referred to the large number of tribes and people and vast lands that they controlled. Within the Confederacy were the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Oneida. The Tuscarora joined them in the 18th century as well. Now, these tribes had lived together in peace under somewhat of a democratic system for hundreds of years. The Battle of Oriskany just absolutely destroyed that. Now, it wasn't like the Senecas as a group decided to join the British in this fight. It was more individual members of those tribes joined John Butler in the effort to protect the British. They actually had all kind of agreed to stay neutral. Everything changed in the Battle of Oriskany, and it destroyed the Confederacy pretty much forever. Now, this Confederacy had lasted for hundreds of years, and it was founded by Hiawatha. So you brothers from Pleasantville, Hiawatha, that's where the name Hiawatha comes from. So Governor Blacksnake of the Senecas wrote later after this battle, "I have seen the most dead bodies all it over that I never did see, and never will again. I thought at that time the blood shed a stream running down on descending ground during the afternoon, and yet some living crying for help, but have no mercy on it to be spared." So it was a great tragedy that day on both sides, and for the Haudenosaunee people, Oriskany is forever known as a place of great sadness. So one thing about this battle is that It was brother against brother, literally. General Herkimer and his brother were on opposite sides of this fight. And then you look at St. Patrick's Lodge. We had Sir John Johnson, we had John Butler on the British side, and then on the American side we had members of the Tryon County militia who were also members of St. Patrick's Lodge, including General Herkimer himself, as you know from episode 3. So now the American losses were pretty heavy. There were about 385 killed that day. What saved the rest of them was Marinus Willett. He left Fort Stanwix to go raid the British camp. Word got back to the Native Americans through the network of scouts that this was happening, and many fled the battlefield to go protect the camp. So Sir John Johnson called it a day. They retreated and the battle ended. Technically it was a British victory, but in the long run it was really tragic on both ends because so many people lost their lives